too, that our mind is deliberately filtering out too.
There's
because they're incompatible with coherence and order and things like that.
There's different ways to think about that. I think there's a YouTube video where they ask you, they're going to show you a clip of a basketball game, and they ask you to count how many times they pass the ball back and forth. And at the end of it, they say, well, it doesn't really matter how many times. There was a gorilla that ran past on the basketball court while you were counting. And you watch it the first time, you're like, you never see this guy in a gorilla suit. You watch it the second time, you're like, how did I miss that? The brain does bring a context, and it assigns like sort of importance to different things. It's true, like if you counted the number of passes, your eyes didn't lie to you about how many passes there were. It also didn't lie to you, your brain didn't lie to you about what you thought was important to look at, because it did all the stuff you told it to do. But when you watch it again and you're like, I'm going to look for anything unusual, or I'm going to look for the gorilla, then it works out right.
I was just going to say, when you say something, like you said when you drew that out that the eyes don't lie to you.
Right.
But it's not really the eyes.
It's the brain.
But I mean that is important to say.
Yeah.
The senses are.
Or the mind.
Yeah. The mind. The mind.
Well, I think it's important actually to say it's the brain, because we don't mentally make that adjustment. It's a pre-conscious process, and so what's that?
Involuntary process?
Yeah, it's an involuntary process. It happens in the nervous system before we're aware of it, and so in that sense, I think it might be important to say it's the brain and not.
It might be a jump to say it's in the nervous system. I'm not
well,
sure. It could be pre-conscious and nevertheless.
It's possible. You're right. I'm assuming a sort of stronger connection than a lot of people.
What I was going to say too earlier is that nearly all the recreational drugs we take to have these hallucinatory experience have corollary drugs that the brain secretes quite naturally and normally. And that means that these gestalts or images in our minds are probably the result not just of a mechanical thing, but rather of power of the imagination that might be very, very similar to hallucinations. It's just that we think there's something more to them than that.
Yeah, if
we rely upon them and they allow us to make guesses about the world that turn out to be true in the future and things like that. We think there's something to them, but they really might be more imaginary than real.
If you imagine that, so this is sort of a different take on the split we were talking about before. Imagine you're a submarine, and there's like the little sonar thing in there, and you've got Clint Howard in there watching because he's always the guy at the sonar. And this
Clint Howard, by the way.
I'm sorry, what did I say, Ron?
No.
That's a good
Clint
Howard.
Oh,
thanks.
That's
Okay,
how I would draw.
if the submarine is like either the mind or the brain or the whole person or whatever, and this is how we're aware of the outside world, is by these blips, I think this can tell us a few interesting things. Number one, if everything is working properly, those blips do mean that there's stuff out here, right? That there's a submarine out there and there's a whale out there, and the colors or the sounds or the smells, the phenomenological ways in which we experience those things are our means of finding out. Just like the submarine guy's blips are his means of finding out this stuff out here. It's not lying to him, that's just the only way he can do it. But talking about hallucinations, it kind of makes sense that if you screw with the circuitry of the sonar screen here or something, it's going to mess things up. This has the equipment to present blips, right? Your brain or your mind has the equipment to present to you images or something, or to form images from what you see. So it's no surprise really that if you mess with that stuff, you're going to get weird images.
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about this, but what the professor said kind of added to what I was going to say. Well, effectively, it all depends on the type of illusion we're perceiving, whether it's caused by our mental states when it comes to the attention-induced illusions, or actual vision, like in regards to straw. It is basically the way the light hits the retina. But regardless, well, even though we might say that there are chemical substances that correspond to particular drugs and various substances that might alter our mental states and perceptions, there is a certain basal state, that there is a certain degree of balance in the brain in regards to these chemicals, that the brain is almost hardwired to maintain. Even if you take a particular drug or substance, your brain will do its best to recover that balance.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's constantly in flux. It constantly corresponds to the senses, which was going to be basically my
Except for the really crazy people where they can't.
Yeah.
Where they can't keep that balance.
Right.
Exactly. So basically, last year, another student made a presentation about perception here, and she brought an interesting example about how mental images form through perception. Basically, this was an example by elimination. Did you know that when a blind person loses his sight, basically when a person loses his sight, becomes a blind person, and is blind for a few years, he loses the ability to visualize things. Then, some types of blindness can be fixed by basically operations. And they had a few examples of people in England in which a guy was blind for 10 years, then using surgery he recovered his sight. He knew how things, the particular conceptual ideas related to the appearance of objects, yet he could not picture it. So when he was told to describe, let's say, a bus, he could describe it using words, but he could not picture it. Similar things happened to people who lost hearing, and later on, when they, through surgery, recovered it, could not exactly find the particular sounds that were represented. They could describe them, but they just could not imagine them. And basically what these examples tend to imply is that all our mental content, or at least most of it, does come from sensory experience.
But the imagination might sort of build on that. to that.
Potentially.
What I wanted to say is, I found this image that you drew kind of interesting because I think it brings up one interesting point that we kind of ignored when we talk about things that are external to the mind or outside the mind or independent of the mind. Those are metaphors because we tend to think of things that are normally outside, like outside the hull of a submarine, there's something. Okay, outside the mind is different from outside of a submarine because outside the mind is not really a different space. Okay?
Right.
So it's misleading to talk about things that are external or independent of the mind as though we understand that in the same way as we do outside of a cardboard box or something like that. It's just not the same thing.
Yeah.
It's misleading, and we have a tendency to take the metaphor too literally and think we're talking about something that's literally independent of the mind when in fact it's probably nothing but an intention. Now you can intend
Well, that's
a
Berkeley.
real physical object in the real world, that's an intended meaning, okay? And nevertheless, it's not independent of the mind strictly because what? It's in the idea of somebody's mind that they think there's something real out there, you know? So is there something real completely independent of everybody's intentions? Well, we tend to think there are from a natural scientific standpoint, but that too might be simply what? Taking this idea of external too literally and not realizing it's kind of metaphorical.
I think there is something really true in that the language we have to talk about mental processes and the relationship between the mind and the world, those bits of language are necessarily metaphorical. Because our language is built up of words that refer to things, physical things, and the relationship from those physical things. Then we abstract further and further up from that, but it's always metaphorically sort of as objects. And for mental entities, we use the same sort of language. Like I had a thought that was in my head, that's a space, but it doesn't seem to... How big was my thought? Was it 4 inches across? That doesn't seem to be the right kind of question to ask about a thought. How big was your thought? I don't know.
You'd measure your brain.
There are ways. It's interesting though that
Big ideas.
there are ways you can measure thoughts and
How big's
emotions
your brain?
mentally without bringing out a tape measure. For example,
Write it down, see how long the word is.
you can, if you wanted to. Some people say that you can't measure love. This is kind of a weird off-topic thing, but or that more generally emotions are something you can't really measure. I think there's a way in which you can. You can measure them ordinally like in order. You can say, this person is the most important person to me, and then this one is next, and this one, or I like pizza the best, and then below that I like ice cream. So in a way, it's a kind of measurement. It's not the same sort of quantitative measurement that we can do for physical objects, but interesting that you can do that kind of thing.
But it can mislead you too.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, you don't want to.
And
It's important to understand that it's metaphorical language when you're referring to mental stuff. But again, I think similar to the submarine, like that's the language we've got. That's the equipment we've got to describe these phenomena. And as long as we're careful with how we use those words, and we don't get into taking them literally, then I think that those are the means by which we can talk about this kind of stuff. So we can't really say those means are unsatisfactory. Let's not talk about it.
Now, have you ever tried to have a conversation with a real neurophysiologist and try to talk about these kinds of things? It's like you're talking completely different languages because their way of thinking about the thinking and the mental and so on are so different from what philosophers usually do that it's very, very hard to even communicate with each other.
There's
so I've had that experience. It's sort of interesting.
Yeah. There's philosophy sort of used to encompass all the natural sciences.
Yes, natural philosophy.
You know, I think especially of Aristotle here in biology and other things. And then as those sciences sort of take off and get really complicated on their own, like philosophy gets cut out of this part, then it gets cut out of this part, this part, this part, where what we mean by philosophy gets narrower and narrower. And I think that these like neuroscientists, they want to say that there's going to come a day when we get consciousness in the same way that we get metallurgy. We just understand how it works. And it's not really a philosophical problem anymore. Like, how do these molecules and nerve tissue, how does this all give rise to this thing we call consciousness? Oh, well, it works like this. Bam, 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 bam. And there's no way to understand for us now, without the science, how that's even possible to make sense of. But we're in the same position that people were at the beginning of a lot of other sciences, where, you know, maybe it's going to make sense.
Very interesting.
It's actually the husband of my wife's cousin that is a neurophysiologist at San Francisco State. And when we get together, he's fond of saying the following: when the neurophysiologists finally figure it out, we'll put you philosophers out of business.
I think we're still going to have ethics, though, right? So
Yeah, we still got ethics, which is
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
I'm gonna be
usually,
doing next
I
week.
feel like there are a couple of problems that they probably wouldn't be able to deal with. I think generally metaphysical problems are sort of
yeah, you're right.
out of their game, and also